Welcome to Humans, Hidden Potentials, and a New World. This is part one of a presentation that I gave back in May, and I'm going to repeat it here. It won't be exactly the same, but it'll be pretty close. What we're going to cover in this presentation is Oelila'o and the War for Earth, a brief history of ET presence, the one rule of existence, the stages of human development, time and the end of time, becoming multidimensional, and a new world. So this is my name when I'm not here. It's pronounced Oelila'o Mak Umrak, and the War for Earth. I won't use all the clicks as I go through this presentation, and I skipped a few that are in there already. But this is the reason that I'm here, or we're going to go through that reason. When I'm not here, I'm a scientist, a librarian, and a certified parent. And the certified parent is really the most important of those. Not everyone can be a parent. Not everyone is certified to develop people. And we are in my civilization, we are very, very focused on that kind of perfection. We do not want dysfunctional people. We want people that are highly functional, highly creative, very healthy, very inventive, very cooperative. So that's getting certified is a very long process. I'm a student also of Mak Umrak. Mak Umrak is a very ancient being who's a master of the eyes. And the eyes are a major tool in pulling form and reality out of the frequency soup or dissolving them back into that soup. And that KH on the end of his name is what indicates that. That's kind of like a PhD certification here. The KH means the ability to create and dissolve realities and all forms of reality, I might add. When I'm not here, I'm from the colony of Ahomla in the Pleiades. There are many, many others living here and working here because there is a war going on for control of this planet. The takeover has been in progress for a very long time, and people have come from across the galaxy to help. Big battles have been fought above our heads for the last 100 years. And the battle above Los Angeles in 1942 was not the first time that people observed unknown flying objects in the sky. You can even see them in paintings from the Middle Ages. And 1947 was not the first UFO to be retrieved. Why do so many people doubt that ETs and UFOs are real? It's because they haven't met any ETs and they haven't seen any UFOs with their own eyes. And so why haven't ETs come forward to announce themselves and save us? Well, a big part of that is because of the Prime Directive. So what is the Prime Directive? It's kind of like our Constitution, but it applies across the galaxy and a good sector of this part of the cosmos. The Prime Directive demands that non-interference, or demands non-interference, and requires that a population save themselves. So when it was obvious that the takeover ETs were beginning to make progress, the people who are trying to prevent that decided that what was needed was a team willing to enter the system and work on the ground as part of the native population. So that's something, there are 4 teams here. I'm part of a team. Each one is fairly big. And that teamwork it's been really pretty good. There is no rule against those willing to be born into the system and work against the takeover. So if you belong to the civilization, you can work against the takeover. The danger is that if you fail and the takeover is completed, you're going to go down with the ship. So that didn't occur to me until after I got here. The idea of losing didn't even occur to me. That wasn't even a possibility. So I volunteered to come here when Makumrak suggested I become part of the team assembling to help rescue the planet Earth. And the reason I did was because it was like a graduation assignment for me to go into a civilization and try to change the consciousness, try to move that population in the right direction. That's all part of human development. And since I happen to have been doing that for hundreds of years already, it looked easy until I got here. So my hope is to earn an invitation to join a team of scientists who go around the galaxy and see life in many, many places. Fingers crossed there. So let's talk about a takeover. A takeover usually takes about 500 years, at least 500 years, sometimes much longer, a couple thousand, but at least 25 generations. A planet will be surveyed. And that surveillance goes on for quite a while. The takeover ETs will learn the language, they'll study the people, they may get involved a little bit in some of the action happening on the ground with a couple of scouts, that kind of thing. But then a village will be targeted for disruption. Now, that disruption can be natural disasters in which parents are wiped out and children are left on their own. It could be droughts or disastrous other weather where crops fail and people go hungry. And that hunger prevents the full development of the human being. Sometimes it's a little more insidious, and energies are projected at somebody, some family on the ground, and that somebody in that family becomes very abusive, sometimes physically abusive, sometimes emotionally, sometimes sexually abusive. So the result of all of that is maladapted children. And those children are then followed, they're tracked and influenced for the rest of their life to become more selfish, mean, greedy, and hurtful. As adults, those children, as they become adults, they're helped to become strong men. And a strong man, in our definition, is somebody who wants power over others, doesn't really want to build cooperation among the greater population. Instead, they go after servants and slaves and that kind of thing. Strong men watch for weaker individuals who are easily manipulated. And gradually, a network of these weak individuals is built up. Often it starts with religion, and then the corporation is introduced. So that's when the corporation is introduced, the takeover is 1/3 complete. So a corporation is used to build the base structures, governance, media, medical, technological, financial, that are needed for the takeover. In other words, they start to build a body of structures, corpus, corporation. That means body. Corporations begin to take the place of the body of humanity on the planet. And that's why it's called a corporation. So once that base of corporations is in place, then the attack proceeds. And it proceeds pretty much as I outlined in Consciousness and Energy, Volume 4. So I'm going to read a little bit, a couple things from Volume 4. Hang on a second. So when there's a takeover plan in place, one of the first things that the takeover group does is try to get control of whatever kind of financial system exists in that civilization. And so for us, that's banking. We call it banking. And they use that banking system to control people as needed. So they set up sources of income that go to themselves. That's what corporations do. They shovel money uphill to whoever's at the top. They also will produce and sell drugs, build and license private prisons. They want a full army of people that are in prison who will work for pennies, nickels, instead of hundreds of dollars. And they develop and extend the flesh markets. Now, the flesh markets are a key piece of the takeover plot, and that the flesh markets include mercenary soldiers, bodies for hire, sex slaves, pedophilia markets, child sacrifice markets, and organ markets. And they make a huge amount of money using all of those things. They also, depending on where the center of power is on a planet, and it was the US for a very long time, they moved that center of power to the other side of the planet. And so for us, that was a move from west to east. And that was followed up, or is always followed up, by getting control of whatever energy that planet is using. And for us, that involved wars in the Middle East and control of the oil. Then the next thing they do is get control of communications. And that involves media, whatever kind of media exists. And so for us, they put people in the newspaper Operation Mockingbird, and began crafting a social media narrative designed to distract people. Then they develop a hidden network of power people. Typically, it's different on each planet, but for us, that network was a network of psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists who were skilled at the following: splitting a mind into multiple personalities, hypnotizing one of those personalities to kill on command, and then hypnotizing that personality to immediately commit suicide as soon as the killing or destructive action was done, and then using this psychiatric network to create guerrilla cells. We call them sleeper cells here, but they're guerrillas who will carry out all kinds of destruction on command. Next, they will then begin to use what are called false flags to create pressure on the people, to make them afraid, to confuse them in terms of how do we defend ourselves against something that we don't know is coming and that's hidden, etc. And in our case, they've also targeted the Second Amendment, which specifically grants the right to bear arms. They also will make sure that they control the levers of power. So in the US, that is the presidency, the Supreme Court, the district court system, and Congress. Next, they will gain control of the food supply, all the seeds, and sometimes all of the equipment used to grow food, if people are using equipment to grow food. They make sure that nutrition levels are kept low because that keeps IQ low. And they move from that into international trade agreements, such as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was then used to channel money, foods, goods, and jobs to various countries as desired, create shortages anywhere they needed in the world. You don't do as they say, they cut you off. And to undermine every country's ability to be self-sustaining. Next, they gain control of the medical system or whatever healing system is there. And that's a very important piece. The idea is to keep people very sickly and then to make money from that as well. They go after the education system after that, and they design curricula that dumb down the majority. They teach basic reading and basic math, no penmanship, minimal science, and a sanitized and really very distorted version of history, so that skills and perception are kept at a minimum. They fast track those who excel in high school and college into the high-paying positions in the corporation. And they teach everyone that you need a job to survive. And then they control the jobs. They make sure that people do not know how to survive in nature. In fact, the goal is to move people away from being able to survive using traditional means and keep them dependent on jobs. Next, they create all kinds of institutions and private foundations supposed to be doing good work in the world, but really function in the hidden corners in the background as private pocketbooks and slush funds for those who are in control. When all of this is up and running well, they embark on the final initiatives, and those are to collapse as many national borders as possible, to get control of the leadership in just a couple of countries in order to use them to threaten the rest of the world, to start wars as necessary, and to create massive destruction of cities and towns. And that's done partly through weaponry, partly through weather, controlled weather, and partly through massive amounts of migration, which leaves everyone unsettled and helps destroy and disrupt culture. So that's the usual kind of plan that is carried out. And because the attack is so diverse, it's coming from every direction, there's little resistance. The people end up focusing on, it's the problems between the Republicans and the Democrats, or it's the problem of the thing in the arm, or it's the, some other problem, the financial problem, whatever. So they don't see the big picture. They don't ever back up enough to see the big picture. Any resistance is managed through disinformation, lies, censorship, and distraction. And here's the most important thing, all reference to ETs or UFOs is denied until the takeover is complete. And sometimes even after that. They don't want you to know that they're here. However, at some point, people begin to realize that something is amiss. And they begin to ask, what is going on? In a nutshell, it is a slow, insidious takeover of a planet. So why would somebody want to take over a planet? What would they be aiming for? What are the goals of those involved in the takeover? Their goals are DNA and slaves. DNA and slaves. The most sought after commodity in the entire cosmos is DNA. So I'm not going to spell this out for you. So I'm just going to ask you a question. You put 2 and 2 together. Why are the biggest billionaires on our planet pushing the VXX and ID? It's because some of them are already involved in interplanetary trafficking of DNA and slaves for labor or sex. Why would they be so interested in our DNA? It's because Earth humans of the ENK line are incredibly tough, resilient. We are amazing. Amazing. And they look at us and say, look at those people. They're still alive. They like that. They like that resilience. They also like the fact that we are bright enough to work with technology. Nobody wants to work with hunter-gatherer stage people. You have to be at least partly educated, but have not developed your full power. So they intervene to make sure that we do not develop our full power. They like the fact that we are able to stay alive in an extremely polluted and toxic world. That's why they don't like to come down here. They don't like that kind of pollution or toxicity, and they keep their environments sparkling clean. They think, or they look at us and they say, look at them, they're still developing their consciousness in spite of dozens of deliberate roadblocks, all kinds of roadblocks and distractions. They like that. So let's look at a brief history of the ET presence here. When people first hear about ETs and UFOs, they end up asking, well, are there really extraterrestrials from other planets or star systems visiting our planet? So I brought together a couple of articles. This first one is from the Los Angeles Times back in February of 1942, which I've already mentioned. And what you see here is the whole bunch of searchlights and anti-aircraft guns pointed up at something in the sky, a ship, an ET ship in the sky, shooting at it, and everything's just bouncing off. Bullets flying everywhere, and then you see some people around the main photo. They're showing the destruction that occurred when this fight was taking place. It was an all-night fight between UFOs, between the good guys and the bad guys. And it was watched by half of the population of Los Angeles. The U.S. Navy had all of their ships anchored off Huntington Beach, California. And so the U.S. Navy was right there. This was all taking place above them. And they tried to shoot them down, but like I said, bullets just bounced off. And that was how the Navy recovered their first retrieval, or had their first retrieval of a UFO. And they immediately began trying to back engineer that thing. Here's the 1947 crash in Roswell. This was a setup by the Greys, but it gave them an excuse to talk to the U.S. They didn't really go down in a thunderstorm. They have equipment, technology that prevents any kind of problem by, from storms. They set themselves up. It was entrapment because they wanted to talk to the U.S. So they allowed themselves to be shot down, and boom, they were on their way. The small Greys came in. They made up a story about their failing planet and their need for help in replenishing their population. They needed to study some of our DNA. And in return, they promised to give us advanced technology. And that's the same thing they do every time. That's the same sob story every time. Small Greys come in, say they need help with their DNA. If we were a little more, or maybe I should say a little less naive, a little more sophisticated in our thinking, we would have recognized that anybody coming across the cosmos has solved most of the problems of life. They didn't need help with their DNA. And the technology they gave us was second-rate stuff, but it was still better than what we had. When other people because our solar system is populated by all sorts of other people. Nobody lives on the outside of their planet. They all live inside. Only the fools live on the outside of the planet because it's too dangerous. So anyway, in 1954, Val Thor and a crew from Venus landed in Arlington, Virginia, and spent 3 years trying to convince the US government that they were being lied to by a group of aliens, and that those aliens would eventually betray them and take over the planet. And that's Val right there in the front. That's his brother right next to him. And the woman you see kind of fuzzy in the background there, that eventually became Val's wife. Eisenhower was the one dealing with Val Thor, and he could not convince the military to go along with the offer by the Venusians to protect us. They were offering to keep us safe, keep us protected, if we would give up nuclear weapons and commit to a benevolent future. That meant giving up our shiny new nuclear bombs. So in the meantime, talking with those ETs in the background were a group of CEOs and military, combination of corporate and military. And they signed an agreement with the Greys, going behind Eisenhower's back and allowing the Greys to begin their hybridization program. So they started immediately. They said, we're just going to pick up a few people and examine their DNA. What they were really doing was picking up people, taking some DNA, using that DNA, studying it to see how they could hybridize us, and then insert those hybrids into the population to be on their side, to help with their cause. It was only later that we learned that the small Greys were slaves to the tall Greys, and the tall Greys were a front for another group called reptilians who were planning to take over the planet. So, kind of summing up there, the role of small Greys is to abduct people and get their DNA, and sometimes their eggs and their sperm and whatever else they want. The tall Greys are master geneticists who conduct the hybridization program that creates a new version of Earth humans. And there's a whole bunch of those here. These new humans are typically engineered to have all of our amazing physical qualities except for curiosity, spunk, and the willingness to fight. Those characteristics come from frequencies, and you just engineer those frequencies out of the DNA, and you've got people who are willing slaves. And then, of course, the reptilians are the controllers who give the orders and pull the strings behind the scenes to orchestrate the takeover in all of its complexity. The takeover was in full swing until July of 2021, when I received word that the reptilians were pulling out. I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God, we've succeeded. OMG. And then I wasn't sure that it was true. It took a few more months before I got confirmation that that was in fact true. But the warning that came with this news was that we would have to deal with the deconstruction and transformation of the network of corporations and CEOs that had been built to control us. They always put a whole network of the ordinary people on the planet into power. And then if they pull out, it looks like those people in power are to blame. And it becomes a, brother against brother kind of fight. So let's look at the one rule of existence. There's one overriding rule of existence for every form of life. And that rule is evolve. It doesn't matter whether you are a human, a plant, an animal, a fish, a tree, it doesn't matter. You are to evolve. So the evolutionary staircase is the same, whether you're a resident of Earth or from somewhere else in the cosmos. And the task for each step on the staircase is also the same. So each step requires the same task. What is that task? Adapt or die. Adapt or die. That's it. So you can then ask, what is it that's actually adapting? What is it that must change? And it's the set of frequencies that make up the human being that have to change. And that change happens through consciousness, through conscious intention. So we are facing the work of reclaiming ourselves, unfolding our full potential, and rebuilding our world. Small task. Actually, I'm being facetious. So in order to do that, in order to reach that full potential, we have to move through the stages of development successfully. What are those stages of development? How do we reach the potential built into us? There's actually 4 things that have to be taken into account. Completing each stage of development successfully, that's the first one, which it should be obvious. The second one is understanding time and timelines. The third one is being able to move beyond the culture of linear thinking to multidimensionality. And the fourth one is to learn the basics of 4D and 5D living. That's how we reach the potential to enter into the higher dimensions of life. And I'll tell you, it's well worth that effort. So let's look at the stages of development. I'm going to talk about the 7 stages here, even though there is an 8th and possibly even a 9th. I did not include those because I'm still working to identify and kind of flesh out those stages. But the first 4 here might be kind of familiar to you if you went to college and you studied Piaget's theory of human development in Psych 101. And those 4 stages are sensory motor, mental operations, concrete operations, and formal operations. And the myth has been for many, many years that when you get to formal operations, you're all grown up. And that is just definitely not true. There are additional stages of development. So let's go through these. And I will say that I pulled these are very sketchy descriptions of what I put in my book, The Evolving Human, chapters 22, 23, 24, and 25. Flesh out this whole, the concepts and the development from the point of view of what's consciousness doing? What's the legacy of moving through that stage successfully? And what's the legacy of not getting through that successfully? So if you want to read the whole development process, then go to The Evolving Human. But we're going to start with stage 1 here. It begins when you're born. It's called sensory motor, and it lasts from birth to 2 years. And in that first 2 years of life, the focus of consciousness is on concrete things. The goal is to explore what's here, what's in this world. And you'll see babies fascinated by all kinds of things. Bright colors, bright forms, funny sounds, animals, pets, birds, all kinds of things. The infant is gathering information and experience through his senses and through the activities he is experiencing. And that it begins the encoding of the brain, which is a fascinating process. I teach what happens to encode the brain in Intuition One. It's really an amazing process. Like I said, we're amazing people. So that encoding of the various lobes, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, the frontal lobe, et cetera, it sets the stage for like the initial, not only the programming, but the initial networking inside the brain. And it also predisposes you to certain chemical states. Chemistry follows frequency. So whatever frequency states you experience right from birth, that sets your chemical response, your feeling response, because chemistry is feeling, and frequency is feeling. And so if you habituate early in life to fear chemicals or anxiety chemicals or pain chemicals, then that's what you're going to go to every time. Every time something disturbs you, you go right back to those habituated chemicals. So that first stage lasts about 2 years, and then we move into mental operations. Mental operations last from about 2 to maybe 6 years of age. And in this period of time, consciousness begins to learn how to abstract the reality. Now, what that means is that all of those things, all those physical objects that you were introduced to in the first 2 years, now you have to be able to make those permanent in your consciousness. You begin to make reality permanent, is how we think of it. Okay. And so it's when you're no longer needing to be focused on all the objects. You're still learning about objects and processes and things, but the main focus is playing with that stuff, with those objects in your mind, playing with those processes in your imagination. So the child plays, but is really practicing participation in the reality. This nurtures the imagination and deepens the development of information banks. You'll have a visual bank, you'll have an auditory bank, you'll have a planning or communications bank, you'll have a parietal bank of information, sensory motor areas. All of those come into play, and they begin to network very powerfully. So that's so that you can then see without having to have it right in front of you. Okay. And that, like I said, that lasts for about the first 2 to 6 years. And then concrete operations we roll into. Now this stage is stage number 3. It lasts from about age 6 to about age 12. None of these are hard and fast edges. And we cycle back around to concrete information, gaining concrete, hands-on information for the personal self. And in this stage, that concrete information needs to be how to survive in this reality. So the child learns all kinds of new responsibilities, basic cleaning, how to prepare a meal, how to clean up after a meal, how to take care of himself, his bath, his ears, his hair, his fingernails, all those kinds of things. That's when children should learn how to take care of animals, how to be responsible for small repairs, et cetera, all kinds of things. Be involved in everything that the adults are doing. When you put them in school, they don't get that. Instead, they learn how to fiddle with paper and pencil. They don't learn how to survive. And so without that, at that stage, without that knowledge of how does this world work and how do I work within it, the child never really understands how the world works and has to be dependent on the people around him or her to tell him how things work. So This stage, when it's successful, concrete operations teaches basic security and survival. Teaches basic security and survival. And that anchors that child for the rest of his life. Then, moving on, stage 4 is formal operations, sometimes called the stage of reaching abstract reality. It's just another cycle of abstract perception and learning. So formal operations begins about 12, 13, 14 years of age and lasts until about 20 or 21 years of age. The focus of consciousness is back to abstraction. And there's also a huge expansion that goes on in this stage. It's almost like a seed that is put in the soil and watered. It expands. This stage is the expansion of the human to being able to reproduce in the same way that that little seed in the ground is going to produce a plant, and that plant is going to produce more seed. So this stage is when young people, let me back up and say this. When your child reaches 12, 13 years of age, you're pretty much done with anything new you want to introduce. You should have taught the ethics, the values, the rules, the manners, the processes before they get to 12. Because at age 12 and after, they're going out into the world to compare what are they doing out there with what goes on in my house over here. And that's a critical stage. Okay, this is a stage where the child shapes his or her life, their structures, their routines, their habits. It's kind of late to be teaching cleanliness or orderliness at this stage. All that should have come before. This is when the child chooses heroes, sports heroes, literary heroes, not very many of those, rock and roll people, YouTubers, et cetera, et cetera. And what is the goal? The goal is that that child compares what's going on in the world with what he learns and then chooses what he wants to, how he wants to live. And he does try to set that up. Parents usually have a connection, but it's going to happen anyway. So the goal, however, in this stage is to be able to think about, okay, if this is the goal, what do I have to do? Who do I have to talk to? What tools, what money, what time, what assistance am I going to need to reach that goal? And to be able to envision the outcome and the process before you put the time and the money into it. That's the goal of formal operations. To assess the results of complex activities and outcomes before taking action, spending money and time, etc. The second thing that happens in this stage is the influx, the infusion of a huge amount of energies as the frequency set swells and expands dramatically. When that occurs, that influx of energy is Godhead energy, which is blissful, which when you add that much bliss to the individual, all of a sudden they're interested in sex, because that's very similar to that energy. It is that energy coming in. So sexual activity often begins, Kundalini and the still small voice within awaken. So lots of times young teens begin to hear voices, they begin to have visions. It scares them. Why? Because we don't have a culture of consciousness. So we give them drugs, we put them in institutions, we tell them to stop that. We tell them they're imagining things. We tell them they're crazy. That's not true. That's part of the expansion of consciousness that's supposed to happen between 12 and 21. So then, whether you successfully complete these stages, you're going to move on to the later stages in life. So the next stage, these next three are stages that I have named and identified just from working with people for 40 years. And so I call this next stage concrete intelligence, where we cycle around back to concrete involvement, concrete consciousness. Okay, this is when from 21 to 35, we are setting up our life. We are choosing a life partner for a lot of people. We are choosing a work or some kind of career. We decide how are we going to use our money or spend our money. What are we going to invest in? Houses, cars, clothing, friends, extracurricular activities, all of that. Now, we're totally free to be doing those things. And we build our life according to, or should be, according to the spirit of the self. If we build that life according to what we think our parents want, or according to what we think the family wants, or the most money that we think we'll have, or the most power, or the most fame, or the least amount of responsibility, those are some of the pitfalls of this stage. We should be building a life based on our passion. What is it we love to do? What is it? Your passion and your gifts, your personal gifts, should be your guides. You should be oriented to health, new ideas, cooperation, and joy. And when you are, psychic abilities blossom and you embrace those. If you're not oriented to joy, health, etc., life, psychic abilities blossom, and sometimes they have some pretty ugly voices. Those are reflections of that voice within. So psychic abilities blossom for good or for ill. And the individual, long about 35, steps back, sometimes 30, sometimes as early as 29, and looks at their life and says typically something like this: wow, I've been out of school for 10 years now. What have I done with my life? Where am I going? So all of that, there's a lot of changes, a lot of deep thinking that happens, that begins shortly after you turn 30. And the individual now is beginning to move into the next stage of development, which I call formal intelligence. And that lasts from early 30s to about 50 years of age. And you cycle back into exploring yourself. What was I thinking? Why did I choose that? Why did I marry him or her, etc.? And what about my job? Do I love this? Do I hate this? How do I start over? Oh my gosh, I've got this big mortgage. Why did I buy this house? And so on. So there's all kinds of abstract work that goes on, and you explore your own consciousness. And if you have developed some comfortableness with your own psychic abilities, that's quite an exciting thing. This is the stage when we want to manifest something new. And so you see all kinds of people in that stage of life trying to figure out, how do I manifest? How do I get this? How do I get that? Well, if you want those things, if you want to be able to manifest, you have to tame the self. That's rule number one. You have to be oriented toward a positive future that you can sustain. When I say that is sustainable, I don't mean that the government is going to sustain. I mean that you can sustain. So if you always wanted to be an artist, you have to figure out how to live on whatever income you can make. And sometimes it's a little skinny in the beginning. So you have to figure out how to do what you love to do and sustain yourself on that, or you have to work 2 jobs. And you experiment with thought and manifestation. And the more you experiment, the more you discover that the thing that works best is absolute inner silence. Inner silence. The more silent you are, the more information comes to you. It just comes. The more that information comes, the more you realize you don't really have to struggle for anything. The more quiet or the quieter you are inside, the more you begin to realize who you really are and what you really want. And then the more you begin to figure out, okay, how do I get there? How do I put that into practice? So that leads you then, after age 50, into the next stage of development, which I call abstract intelligence or formal intelligence. And I like formal better because it's a concrete stage. I don't want to call it abstract intelligence and say it's a concrete stage. So the next stage that you move into is what I call abstract intelligence, and it's for it lasts from 50 and up, usually to about 65 or thereabouts, maybe 70. And it's actually a concrete stage or a stage of concrete truth and reality. This is when you are in your power. This is the people who are between 50 and 70 are the people who are making the decisions that run the world. So this is about truth. The focus of consciousness is truth and reality. And this is where you experiment with self-transformation. What can I become? You know, you might target that job over there because you feel you can handle it. It might be something else. Fluid awareness should be in your back pocket. Expansion of boundaries occur, and you discover that you are everything in the world. There's a renewal of self. It has to begin by 55, 60 years of age. It's never too late. But that renewal of self makes a huge difference. Getting healthy again, getting quiet, getting yourself situated or focused on the thing that you would love to be doing, raising your voice in the way that you would like to raise your voice. What you discover in this stage is your power. And that power, you end up looking at, okay, what can I do with this power inside myself as well as outside? So when you discover your power, that's a big step. The discovery of power is something that we need to keep moving toward full speed ahead at this point in time. We need it. So to reach your full potential, you need, and this is kind of a summary of each one of those stages, you need access to full sensory input. Without all the assumptions that blind you or the expectations that mess up your perception, you need clarity. You need access to full sensory input. What's real? What's really happening here? You need freedom to play. That's the basis of all creativity, inventiveness, and moving yourselves or your family or your country or whoever toward freedom. You can't do it from a one down, angry position. Well, you can, but it's pretty messy. Doing it playfully, very, very different. Number 3 is hands-on experience in reality. If you don't know how reality works, then you're not at 6, you're not going to be able to put together a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But at 56 or 76 or whatever, you should have learned the reality of a whole bunch more stuff. If your hands-on experience is how do you assemble a rocket ship to go to Mars or the moon or wherever, that's really important. You need hands-on experience. Number 4 is the ability to imagine various outcomes. That's critical. And to see many, many varieties or various outcomes, and then to choose which one you want. Not just be stuck with something that you think you're the victim of. Number 5 is your intuition. You need your intuition and your psychic senses, the clairs, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, clairnascence, clairgustance. You need those. You need that plus logic. Intuition and logic are meant to work together. And when you put them together, they work beautifully. Number 6 is a commitment to life, health, and joy. Why do you need that? Because otherwise you're going down. A commitment to life. When everything you do nurtures life, you'll have eternal life. I'll say that again later. Number 7, you need your power, and especially the courage to use it. And the courage to use it wisely and well, playfully, knowing how reality works, being able to assess different outcomes, and then use intuition along the way to adjust as needed. You need your power. So, understanding the stages of development gives us a window into what we can become, but understanding time and the end of time opens the door to our potential as multidimensional beings. So let's talk about time and the end of time. Time is not as we think of it. Okay? Time, quote unquote time, is simply a snapshot of the frequencies in play and their relationships as we perceive them. Okay? So you can tell when something was happening by the design, the shape, the color. So here you see a covered wagon. What do you think? 1700s, maybe 1600s? Here you see a green pickup truck, looks like I don't know. That's probably not a Model T or whatever, but let's just say it's one of the early models. Then we have a little red sports car. Each one of those is the same concept expressed in a different way and signaling a different set of frequencies. So when the assortment or arrangement of frequencies move and shift, we say time has gone by. Time has gone by. In other words, time does not move. It is perception and frequency that move. That's critical. You're just moving your perception. We move our attention from one set of frequencies to another while adapting ourselves to the thoughts, acts, and feelings each set produces. Each thing that we focus on produces a response inside ourselves, and that response is a little shift in our own frequencies, which produces a different feeling. So when we move our perception from thing to thing, we think time is going by. Or we say time is going by. So here's a definition. Time, as we think of it in the third dimension, is the result of moving your perception from one set of frequencies to another in a linear fashion, one after the next after the next. Okay? The practice of linear perception leads to linear thinking and the belief that this must happen before that can happen. Let me say that again. The practice of linear perception leads to linear thinking and the belief that this must happen before that can happen. However, linear perception and linear thinking then lead to the belief that you are not the cause of things. A set of prior events or circumstances is the cause. You have no responsibility for what occurs in the world. You are merely the perceiver, the objective observer of action happening outside the self. And that idea of being an objective observer has been pushed for hundreds of years. This idea that you are and must maintain the stance of an objective observer leaves you outside the action happening and leads to the belief in other directed causality. Okay? You remain outside whatever's happening. You're just an observer. Everybody else is making stuff happen, or everything else, or something else is making stuff happen. When other directed causality is in place, subjective input becomes irrelevant. You become irrelevant. What you think, what you feel, what you perceive, it's irrelevant. And so some examples of being irrelevant is you feel like a victim. Another example is the democracy you're in looks like a farce. When linear perception, linear thinking, and other directed causality are in place, you lose power. In fact, you don't lose power as much as you never know you have it. You just grow up never reaching your power. And you're taught to give it away at every turn. The result is that the human never discovers the power of his own consciousness or how to use it effectively. What is power? What is it? It's the ability to direct consciousness. It's the ability to direct consciousness. Because linear perception and thinking, along with other directed causality, lead us away from understanding that consciousness is the seat of power, we end up hypnotized by linear time, and we remain the victim of outside forces. We do not question the outside forces making things happen because we think we have no role and no power. And we pretend not to see. It is so painful to think that we have no power and no role that the result is we end up pretending not to see in order to keep our illusion from being broken and putting ourselves at risk in an area of life that we just have never been taught about. So we pretend not to see, or we pretend to not see. The results, we end up in the position of being easily fooled, taken advantage of, and manipulated. Why? Because pretending to not see means you miss a whole bunch of stuff. You just don't get it. So we end up making poor decisions based on distorted perception and incomplete information. And that's the end of part 1. Let's take a short break. I'll be back with part 2.